Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, now that it has Governor Ehrlich, is the Inner Purple Line back on track? Montgomery Councilman George Leventhal hopes so. Constitutional scholar Jamie Raskin joins us to discuss his latest book, Overruling Democracy, the Supreme Court versus the American People. Remember the Gulf War syndrome from Iraq War I? Well, some vets say the Pentagon's use of depleted uranium may be a cause. Plus, we'll take note of the coalition of the unwilling and hear about organized labor's stand on Iraq War II from former National Union officer Bob Mollenkamp. We've got the jazz-influenced folk sounds of the Joanne Justice Trio. Poet Holly Bass offers a timely boogie, and MacArthur Fellow Liz Lerman chats with University of Maryland Dance Department Chairman Alcine Wiltz. Welcome to the forum at the Coffee House. Call it the Inner Purple Line or the Bi-County Transit Way, as Governor Ehrlich prefers. The transportation plan the Maryland governor recently submitted to Congress calls for funding an above-ground mass transit line linking Bethesda, Silver Spring, College Park, and New Carrolton. Something of a surprise given Ehrlich's negative statements about the Purple Line on the campaign trail. And for sure, his real priority remains road building, especially the inter-county connector. Ehrlich proposes that Congress spend $800 million for the ICC alone, but just $662 million for all mass transit projects in the state combined. So the administration's transitway proposal is short on conviction. That's problem number one for Purple Line supporters. Problem number two, Transportation Secretary Robert Flanagan says he plans to explore whether the transitway might be built with less costly buses rather than rail cars. So there are lots of I's to dot and T's to cross in the state's proposal. And problem three, there's still opposition to the Purple Line route from Chevy Chase residents who fear it will degrade the park character of the Capitol Crescent hiker-biker trail between Rock Creek Park and Bethesda, or traverse a country club golf course. Still, Purple Line proponent Montgomery County Councilman George Leventhal prefers to see the glass as half full.
Well, look, I would prefer that we were all able to come together around a specific proposal. So far, that hasn't happened. Governor Ehrlich and Secretary Flanagan have not provided great specificity as to what this thing will look like, where it will go, or how much it will cost. The Inner Purple Line proposal that's been under study for several years now provides that specificity. We know what it would look like. It would be light rail. We know where it would go in Montgomery County. It would use the existing right-of-way, which was purchased for that purpose, and we know roughly how much it would cost. It would cost about $375 million from Bethesda to Silver Spring and about $1.3 billion for the entire project continuing into Prince George's County. We don't know the answers to those questions for a busway. There will come a time when the competition for these projects really becomes stiff, where our lack of specificity might hurt us politically. Having said that, I'm glad that the governor has expressed his support for mass transit, and we'll take what we can get. We're better off now than we were during his campaign when he said he was opposed to transit at all between Silver Spring and Bethesda.
And can we fill in those blanks between now and the time of decision?
Probably not. I think probably Congress will act before we completely know the results of the study on the busway versus the train option.
So, in summary, the Purple Line is alive, but not necessarily well, would you say?
Well, it's alive. I'll never give up on this. I just feel so strongly that it's the right thing to do, that it's something that we can achieve in this decade that will really improve people's mobility and make their lives easier, make it easier for working families to earn a living and to have more time with their families. The tangible benefits of this are so strong, and the fact that we can get it done in this decade is so compelling. I sure hope it happens, and I'm going to keep working on it every day.
Welcome to Writer's Block at the Coffee House. Thanks to the war in Iraq, certain news stories have gotten short shrift of late. You may have noticed that while we have had military updates on the hour, many other stories aren't receiving the kind of coverage they once did. For instance, there is the complicated story about our own Supreme Court. We've heard talk about affirmative action in the court recently, but not a whole lot more. And some of us would like more information. We'd like more discussion about the highest court in the land and its role in certain pivotal events, like the election of President George W. Bush. Jamie Raskin has taken it upon himself to write an analysis of the Supreme Court today, its conservative members, and its partisan decisions. Overruling Democracy, the Supreme Court versus the American people, is a thorough examination of the court and its recent rulings. Jamie Raskin is a professor of constitutional law at American University. He has represented Jesse Jackson, Ross Perot, Greenpeace, and the people of Washington, D.C., among others. His work has appeared in Slate, The Washington Post, The Nation, George, and many other publications. He lives in Tacoma Park, Maryland. Welcome to the Coffee House, Jamie.
Thank you so much for having me, Lisa.
So, Overruling Democracy, you wrote this book because that's what the Supreme Court is doing.
That was the best way I could think of to try to capture what's been going on.
How so?
Well, I think of it in terms of outputs and inputs. We elect Democratic representatives, and the court has been striking down at a furious pace the outputs of democratic government. The Violence Against Women Act, Congress passed, struck down in large part by the Supreme Court. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act, struck down by the Supreme Court. The Gun-Free School Zones Act, struck down by the Supreme Court. Parts of the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, parts of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and on and on. The Supreme Court, and always by a 5-4 margin, has been deciding that Congress has somehow reached too far and basically violated the rights of the states, or violated federalism, which is a word that doesn't even appear in the Constitution and wasn't even used by the Supreme Court until the 1930s, as far as I can tell. So the outputs of democratic government are being struck down by this court. At the same time, the Supreme Court is interfering with the inputs to democratic government. The most spectacular example, of course, is Bush versus Gore, where the Supreme Court intervened to tell the Florida Supreme Court that it could not order the recounting or the counting in the first instance of about 170,000 ballots.
And you call that ruling worse than the Dred Scott decision?
Well, yeah, a number of conservatives have been upset about this. The decision, I said, was much more illogical and much more poorly reasoned than the Dred Scott decision was. Of course, the consequences of Dred Scott were worse, although they were probably inevitable. Essentially, what happened in the Dred Scott decision was the Supreme Court said, using the original intent jurisprudence that the Rehnquist Court likes, that the Constitution was designed to be a white man's compact, and no African American could be a citizen within the meaning of our Constitution. But it was, several hundred pages, and it was rooted in history, and it was a very logical decision. Bush versus Gore was this slapdash, madcap decision that was written overnight, essentially. It took a couple of days between oral argument and the release of the decision. The court had no authority to base it on, nothing in the text of the Constitution, nothing in prior precedents that would justify intervening to tell a state Supreme Court how to interpret state law, nothing to justify an injunction against the counting of ballots in a presidential election. And then the Supreme Court, to put the icing on the cake, said that this case does not apply ever again in the future. In other words, it has no precedential value. So essentially, it's not law. So when I say it was worse than the Dred Scott decision, I mean as a specimen of legal reasoning, it was really horrible. And it's hard to find a Supreme Court decision that was worse than Bush versus Gore, but it was quite emblematic of what the Rehnquist Court has been doing over the last 10 or 15 years.
And you talk about a lot of different things that they've been doing. You talk about the education system. You talk about white supremacy as part of the backbone of their... Would you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, let me give you sort of a broader historical context. I mean, the nation began not as a democracy, but as a slave republic of Christian white male property owners over the age of 21. And it's been through the process of political struggle and constitutional amendment that we've opened the democracy up to groups that had been excluded and oppressed before to women and African Americans. Okay, the Supreme Court has played almost always a conservative or reactionary role in that process. In the 18th century, the Supreme Court did nothing for left out groups. In the 19th century, its two big decisions were the Dred Scott decision and then Plessy v. Ferguson, which said even after we put the words equal protection into the Constitution, that it was fine for a state to segregate blacks and whites in public accommodations in the train cars of Louisiana. So that's the 18th and 19th century. In the 20th century, for basically the first half of the 20th century, the court adhered to Plessy v. Ferguson, and for the first several decades struck down all progressive or almost all progressive social and economic laws during the so-called Lochner period, which is held up as the worst period of judicial activism we've had. Then we had Brown versus Board in 1954, and for a period of about 2 decades, we actually had a court interested in a progressive constitution that opened the democracy up. But it came to an end in the 1970s with decisions like Milliken versus Bradley saying it was perfectly acceptable for a state to spend twice as much money on schools in rich districts as public schools in poor districts. I'm sorry, that was San Antonio versus Rodriguez. In Milliken versus Bradley, the Supreme Court said that federal courts could not order desegregation between the cities and the suburbs, which really gave strength to white flight. All right, and now, today, we are in a period of what I think is really the most intense judicial activism we've ever seen, with the court striking so many laws down and denying the existence of the right to vote. The way that the court began its decision in Bush v. Gore was saying there is no federally protected constitutional right of the citizen to vote in presidential elections.
Which is, I mean, I always assumed that was a constitution, but you're saying it's
Everybody
not.
does. Everybody assumes it's the right to vote, but the Supreme Court says no. If the Florida legislature wants to get rid of the popular vote in presidential elections, that's fine. If it wants to disregard the popular vote in presidential elections, that's fine. But it's not just presidential elections. I got to be co-counsel in Alexander versus Daley, which was the D.C. voting rights case, and we brought a case alleging that Congress's disenfranchisement of people in Washington, D.C. violates equal protection. And the court in the case ended up saying, look, that would be right if there were a constitutional right to vote. But there's not a constitutional right for citizens to vote. There's a constitutional right for qualified citizens to vote. And the way you get qualified is you live in a state, and the state decides to grant you the right to vote. So we've got lots of disenfranchised people still in America. We've got the people in D.C. who have no voting representation in the House or the Senate. We've got 1.5 million former felons who've been disenfranchised in 8 states, mostly in the Deep South, because the states have said, well, you once committed a crime, even though you're out, even though all the other states give you the right to vote, we're going to disenfranchise you permanently. We have millions of people who live in the territories who are American citizens who aren't represented. If you look at it's interesting, if you look at our Constitution in a global context, almost every constitution on earth now begins with the right to vote. Like the new South African Constitution is a great example. It's a beautiful constitution. It starts off by saying every citizen of South Africa has a right to vote at every level of government. Our Constitution does not have a right to vote, and our Supreme Court refuses to interpret it that way.
In this book, you also make some recommendations in the couple of minutes we have left. Would you talk about ways to change this? Well,
one of them is we need a constitutional amendment guaranteeing a right to vote. Another is we need a constitutional amendment guaranteeing a right to an equal education, because the court has said that you can base public school financing on property taxes, and that means that the wealthier areas get more money in their schools. Even if the poorer areas are taxing themselves harder, they produce less revenue because the property is worth less. And then essentially what that means is the education of the kids is worth less. And that really shouldn't be able to stand in the 21st century. So we need an amendment about that. And I have a chapter in which I argue that we need to get rid of the Electoral College, that every other constitution on earth says that the person who gets the most votes wins. It seems logical, but we have this antiquated system that's really a relic of white supremacy and the determination of the southern states to entrench their power, that we use this Electoral College system. And it worked that way. In the beginning, 4 out of our 5 first American presidents were slave masters who brought slaves with them into the presidency. So we've got to look hard at the Electoral College, how it works, and the fact that we don't have a national ballot. We have a crazy system with thousands of electoral jurisdictions all over the country, and we never even really add up all the votes to see who won.
Right.
So I was over in France, and they said, you Americans have no antiques except, of course, for your Constitution. We've got to maintain the vision of an alive Constitution that the people can amend, and we really have to take the democracy back from the Supreme Court because they continue to define our politics in the most narrow way possible.
And we're just about to close, but would you say that quote by George Orwell about patriotism and nationalism?
Well, Orwell distinguished between patriotism and nationalism. He said patriotism is about a love of the people of your country and the values of the country and the institutions. And nationalism is a military psychology where we all sink ourselves into the corporate aims of the overall group.
Yes.
And we lose ourselves in it. And he says it's important to try to remain patriotic and to be very wary of nationalism. And I say we need to be constitutional patriots in America. Now we have to be loyal to the values of our Constitution. We have to criticize our Constitution as we love it and then make it better. And we have to look at the Constitution as a living document.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thanks to Jamie Raskin for sharing his research and insights into the state of the judiciary and the nation. Again, his new book is Overruling Democracy, the Supreme Court versus the American People. I'm Lisa Page, and this has been Writer's Block.
Welcome to In Sickness and in Health at the Coffee House. The Pentagon claims it's safe, but many veterans of the last Iraqi war beg to differ. We're talking about depleted uranium, and we're talking with Steve Robinson, Executive Director of the National Gulf War Resource Center in Silver Spring. Welcome, Steve.
I'm very glad to be here.
Steve, what is depleted uranium?
Depleted uranium is a byproduct of a nuclear reactor process where we take rods, spent fuel rods, and process them to use as weapon systems in certain types of missiles and bombs, as counterweights in certain types of aircraft, and as protective armor on certain vehicles that the military uses.
What are the military benefits of depleted uranium?
If you have a tank that's got depleted uranium armor and another vehicle fires a standard armor-piercing shell at a tank that has depleted uranium armor, it could very well just bounce off the tank. It has fabulous penetrating properties. It's a very dense product. It can penetrate as if taking a hot knife to a stick of butter, 18 inches of steel. If this pin were the sabot, the round, as the round strikes a hard target, because of the speed and velocity and the properties of depleted uranium being a very dense metal, it begins to self-sharpen. And as it self-sharpens and penetrates like butter, whatever object it strikes, it kicks off oxides. And those oxides go into the air, and they are respirable. It appears that depleted uranium has an after-killing effect. In other words, once it has been used on the battlefield, it continues to harm. And that is something that needs to be looked at very seriously. I think the Europeans are leading the way in that respect, and the United States is reluctant to lose its very powerful weapon.
The Pentagon says it's safe. What leads you to believe that it's a cause of the Gulf War illnesses?
Depleted uranium is one of 5 exposures that happened in the first Gulf War. The symptoms of Gulf War illness range from something as mild as having a rash on your body that is unexplained and can't be explained by a dermatologist. Other things from that going up to the more extreme could be chronic pain in your joints and every portion of your body, feeling as if you have needles and pins, constantly sticking you. Irritable bowel syndrome is the inability to have a solid stool. Fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, multiple chemical sensitivity, Lou Gehrig's disease, multiple sclerosis, cancer. All of these things are things that Gulf War veterans suffer from. But the biggest one that they suffer from is not being told the truth about the exposures they had in the First War. And depleted uranium is one of those issues in which We could answer the question if we really applied ourselves, but there doesn't seem to be the will to do it right now.
Are the current crop of U.S. soldiers and Iraqi civilians endangered by depleted uranium?
Well, certainly the experience of the 1991 Gulf War said that depleted uranium exposures were a risk. Our soldiers have, as a result of lessons learned and work that our organization has done, specifically a gentleman named Dan Fahey and others, has convinced the Department of Defense to conduct training to prepare soldiers how to operate in and around vehicles that have been struck by depleted uranium, but obviously the Iraqis won't have the benefit of that training.
Fingers crossed that there won't be another generation of Gulf War vets or Iraqi civilians riddled with these same yet unexplained illnesses. A big thank you to Steve Robinson of the National Gulf War Resource Center. I'm Cathy Kristiansen, and this has been In Sickness and in Health.
Makes no sense for me to love you. Makes no sense to even try. Oh, my mind knows I can't have you, but my heart does not know why. Makes no sense to think about you, 'cause it always makes me cry. Yet thoughts of you remain as true as the phases of the moon, steady as the ocean tide, crashing over me. Oh, you surround me, and it feels so good till you pull me down. I'm tumbling around and around and around. The more I fight, the more I fall. It makes no sense to me at all.
Hi, welcome to Work Life at the Coffee House. Before the war on Iraq began, the AFL-CIO stated that the President has not fulfilled his responsibility to make a compelling and coherent explanation to the American people and the world about the need for military action against Iraq. Some were surprised that labor was not more supportive of the war, given the AFL-CIO's foreign policy positions in the past. Has there been a change in labor's viewpoint? Let's ask Bob Mullenkamp, former Executive Vice President and Organizing Director of the National Hospital Workers Union and Teamsters Organizing Director for many years. Bob is one of the organizers of U.S. Labor Against the War. Welcome to the Coffee House.
Good evening.
Bob, what is labor's position on the war?
Well, you quoted from the AFL-CIO Executive Council statement questioning the President's policies, saying he had not made a case for war. This follows the passage of resolutions by almost 300 local unions opposing the war, 44 central labor councils, bodies representing major cities of unions around the country, and 7 national unions. These unions comprise over 5.5 million members who, before the AFL-CIO statement, had come out opposing the war.
Mm-hmm. Is this a position that's different than what labor might have taken in the past?
Well, I think it's a big change. Historically, unions, the official labor movement has supported war efforts in this country. There's no history of them opposing the war. Many of our listeners will recall pictures on the front page of the papers during the Vietnam era of construction workers, hard hats, beating up war protesters. So this is a very big change.
And why has this change come about? What do you think are some of the reasons?
I think there are a lot of reasons. I think you have to begin with this war. the president never really made the case to a majority of the American people, working families or other, about the reasons for choosing to go to this war, unilaterally, preemptively, without broad international support. Second, I think that the membership of unions has changed from earlier periods, and the membership of unions is now more likely to question government policies. Much of the leadership of the labor movement came through the Vietnam era, and I think now feels like we have a responsibility, we have an obligation in a democracy to question our government on these issues. And I think the fourth element is very important. This is President Bush's war. And many unions, many working families feel that this president does not represent their interests, that in fact he is advancing tax policies, social policies, budget policies, very much harmful to the interests of working families. So they come into this looking at him already as not acting in the interests of working families, and so I think they were open to question him on a question of foreign policy and war and peace also.
Interesting. Tell us something about the debate that went on, the internal discussions that went on at the AFL-CIO Executive Council meeting, for example, and elsewhere when this issue was up.
It's interesting because the debate in the first case was not about being for the war or against the war. The argument in the first case was whether or not their union, a local union, a national union, should get involved in a matter of war and peace. Historically, unions in this country have not got involved. So the first question for people was really what I call the threshold question. Why should my union get involved at all? Once people got through that, there were very few who would argue for this war. It was very difficult to find union leaders, activists, and members who were for this war. They just weren't sure their union should take a position. And I think what persuaded them that it should is the compelling moral nature of this. It just didn't make sense, unilateral, preemptive, all those things. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about it in a minute, also the economic consequences of this war for working families.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've been one of the people involved in forming this organization, U.S. Labor Against the War. Tell us something about how that got started.
Well, in the fall, through the summer and into the fall, there were dozens of unions who passed resolutions and started to become active in anti-war activities. And we began gathering this information and disseminating it around the country and coordinating activities. And by December, we had several dozen unions who had come out against the war, and we decided to call a national meeting, which we did in Chicago at a big Teamster local in Chicago. And about 125 trade unionists came from about 70 unions, and we formed U.S. Labor Against War. Since that time, as I say, over 250 local unions and national unions have openly come out against the war.
Mm-hmm. Are there some unions, though, that have taken a different position? Is this completely unanimous, or are there some unions that have a position perhaps closer to what the position might have been 10, 20 years ago?
They haven't come out that way. Mm-hmm. Unions that have got past the threshold question and said, should we get involved in this at all, have generally come out against the war. There are no pro-war positions taken by unions that I know of in this country.
That's interesting. Well, tell us about some of the things that unions have actually done, some of the activities, some of the, what are some of the different ways in which unions have demonstrated their views on this war?
Unions have, for the first time ever, at many of the national demonstrations, had speakers who are speaking on behalf of their union, on behalf of this broader anti-war labor coalition. There have been huge labor delegations at many of the demonstrations. For example, the most recent one, March 22nd in New York, there were probably 10,000 trade unionists in the labor delegation. That same weekend in Chicago and San Francisco and Los Angeles, there were very large labor delegations and labor speakers at those demonstrations. We also had, in early March, we had a day of worksite activities at work sites all over the country where people would put on buttons, a Labor Against War button. They would hand out leaflets. They would have quiet vigils at lunchtime. In some cities, the unions gathered together and they went to lobby elected federal officials to take stronger positions against the war. So there are worksite activities, and then there generally are the activities that other mainstream Americans have been involved in opposing this war.
Now that the war has begun and the fighting has begun, what has labor said? I mean, what has been the position once the war has actually started?
Well, it's a difficult question for everyone who opposed the policies and the reasons that got us into this war. Once you're in a war, you support the troops. And the official AFL-CIO position, as stated by President Sweeney, is to support the troops. In a letter to state federations of labor, President Sweeney also said that he thinks the president did not do the right thing by the American people by choosing to go to war instead of continuing to try to resolve the issues through diplomatic means. In our own surveys, we've actually done surveys of all the unions involved in this movement, what their members are thinking. And we find that members generally are more reluctant to come out and be active during the war because you want to support the troops.
Sure.
But they have not changed their minds at all about how wrong the policies were that got us into this war. That it's preemptive, that it's unilateral, that it's a war of choice, not a war of necessity, that the president just didn't make his case.
Mm-hmm. Are there plans, what are the plans now for future activities, for other ways of explaining labor's position and getting labor's position out there? Anything in particular planned?
Yes, we have a number of things that we're doing and a number of issues that we are already talking about very strongly. For example, on the veterans issue. I think many of our viewers know that at the time that the president is sending our young men and women abroad, he's also proposing to cut the veterans budget by $75 billion over 10 years. We have formed a labor veterans committee to defend the benefits that veterans are entitled to and to raise that issue. We are on tax day on April the 15th, joining with other major coalitions. And basically at every major post office in the country, we'll have leaflets and tables and materials out there explaining how the cost of this war is going to take a terrible price against working families. I'll give you just a very simple number. The current budget for the war, which they're talking about passing, is $77.9 billion, the first budget for the war. The cumulative state budget deficit of all the states is $80 billion. States are cutting services for schools, for health care, for transportation, for housing, for everything in order to deal with that budget deficit that all of them have together. It's almost the same number exactly as the initial cost of this war. So we are going to engage vigorously in the debate in this country about guns and butter. That you cannot choose to start wars like this for reasons like this and spend this money without having it take a terrible toll on working families. So we're going to talk about that issue big time.
Well, thanks, Bob. Many thanks to activist Bob Mullenkamp for his insights into labor and the war in Iraq. I guess times do change, and it seems like organized labor is changing too. I'm Fred Feinstein, and this has been Work Life.
Child of the revolution, pushing evolution on. Wild, quintessential freedom teeters on the edge of dawn. Where did you think all of your questions would lead? Weren't you willing to burn and to bleed now that you did you think all of your questions would lead? Weren't you willing to burn and to bleed? Now that you rolled away the stone, you've got to reap what you've sown. Walls tumbling down around you, the freedom that you found is hard. Truth is difficult to hear and harder still to disregard. Where did you think all of your questions would lead? Weren't you willing to burn and to bleed? Now that you rolled away the stone, you've got to reap what you've sown. Now that you rolled away the stone, you've got to reap what you've sown.
We'd like to welcome the Joanne Juskus Trio to the musical tradition segment of the Coffee House. That was great. What was the name of that tune?
That was called Rebel.
Okay. And I heard in that tune lots of different things. If I were going to walk into a CD store where your CD's for sale, what bin am I likely to find it in?
I don't think they have a bin for that, for
Okay.
our music yet. It's actually in the pop bin when you do go into Tower
Right.
Records, but our influences are pretty wide. Everything from jazz to folk to progressive rock to classical, Celtic. We kind of, and even some Eastern influences.
And you do some of the writing?
Yes, Brad and I
Okay.
do most of the writing together.
And this is, I know, I've seen you perform solo, and now I'm
Mm-hmm.
seeing you in a trio format, but I hear that sometimes it burgeons up to a five-piece.
That's right. Yeah, we add bass and drums.
Okay.
And actually Brad and Willard are both multi-instrumentalists, so we pull in a lot of different
Great,
instruments.
great. You are from the Columbia, Maryland area?
Yes.
Okay. You've been living here about how long?
10 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
And, well, you got another one for us?
Sure.
What's it called?
This is called Good Thing.
Okay, take it away.
This once was a world where a squirrel could go from Boca Raton to Bangor, never touching the ground, hanging bound like a hound to chase down that gray filibuster. There was a time when the shine of a star, no matter how far, could be seen beyond the scream of this greed machine. The blood of the wound, the light of the moon, mending and bending the brightened room. It's a good thing there is no end. Wild and hard, I know this must be a good thing. To take so much harm and call it a blessing. Fixing your tie, your feet planted wide on the side of a diamond. The cold granite ground, the seat of the crown, Manhattan Island. I stayed up all night listening for that mockingbird's charms. All I could hear are beepers and car alarms, catcalls and bruises, teardrops and firearms. You laugh too loud, step away from this vehicle. Confusion won't lie, it only points out the way of the miracle. Wild be a good thing to take so much harm and call it a blessing. The familiar's a dangerous place to hide. And I've gotten used to sitting here watching you subdivide. From your lunch to my face, who's running this race? Good thing that this place has plenty of space on the inside. When all has been burned, when all is returned, we'll have the wake then. With a push of the pen and we're at it again, ready and willing to be taken. From treetop to treetop on this trail of this world, the good of this thing, the mother world, I am shaken. Wild and hard. I know this must be a good thing to take so much harm and call it a blessing. Wild and hard. I know this must be a good thing, good thing, good thing to take so much harm and call it a blessing, blessing, blessing. Wild and hard. I know this must be a good thing to take so much harm and call it a blessing.
What's the boogie? That is the question. To groove or not to groove? We are one nation, banging drums. Funky has new meaning. It's the bomb. That's what the people be saying. It's the bomb. And you, what are you going to do? Put your needle in the groove and skip in place? Or you could spin your laser light CD optical beam, sending out the fresh sound, calling all satellites, calling all lovers and dreamers and head nodders and body poppers and record spinners and lovers. One nation, indivisible, indivisible. Rock, rock the planet, rock. Now somebody, everybody, somebody scream.
Welcome to In Step at the Coffee House. We have a man of many accomplishments on the show this day, not the least of which is helping 5 generations of college students find their inner dancer. Alcine Wiltz is celebrating his 20th anniversary as chair of the University of Maryland Dance Department. He's also a performer, teacher, and a choreographer of both musical theater and postmodern forms of dance. The commitment to this breadth is unusual in the field of dance. Let's find out how he does it. Welcome, Alcine, to the Coffee House.
Glad to be here.
So glad you're here. So let's start with something a little personal. Maybe just tell us, how is it that you came to the University of Maryland?
Well, I had had 15 years prior to coming here in '83. I had worked in the dance department, developed a dance program at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, just outside of St. Louis, and had been there and built a company in the St. Louis area. So was running this company and running a dance department. And the dance department there was a part of the theater department as well, combined. So it had been a very exciting time. But I began to feel, after that amount of time, that I had come to a point where I had done as much as I could probably do, and was time to try some new challenges, and was beginning to try to think about another higher administrative post, and thought that in order to do that, I probably would need to be chair of a larger program and in probably a larger institution. And so happened that this job became available, and I was successful in achieving the position, and so came on to do it.
So running a dance department for 20 years, I know there are some things that you've been able to institute at the program that's really particular, including the guest artists. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's been exciting. The program has gone from 1967, it became a separate department.
Well, you should explain to people that most times dance programs are part of either theater programs or sports programs.
That's, yeah.
So in the 60s, there was this movement to get dance separate and to let it shine in its own light.
And Marilyn was a leader in that, and Dorothy Madden, who founded the program. And so to come to this program that was well established by the time I got here in '83, and to come and then try to take what was here and build on it with what was going on in the field and what the university was doing. So it was trying to ride that. The greatest thing for me, I suppose the biggest thing, was the good luck to have the university and the state commit to building a new facility.
Incredible.
That would bring the arts together.
Well, we have a clip that shows one of your guest artists teaching in this beautiful new facility. Let's take a look.
All right.
Fantic is just out and around. Out to go pull my torso around. There you go, shift. That just everything rotates to the parallel. Shift, send the right arm up. Now this whole thing's going to step to that back diagonal. Turn out your right foot. Bring the back arm underneath. Exchange, turn out. Now this is pretty quick. Turn out, parallel, left, right, stage. And you're right there. You're just ready to go. Up, down, go. And here you have no time to go here, there. There, stay, I think stay over. There you go, that's beautiful. Yada. Exhale, 8, and 1.
Now, who is teaching?
That was Keith Thompson. He was here last week with the Creech Company, one of the guest artists. With the center, we work with them to bring us various artists, professional companies to the campus. And this was one of those companies. And when the companies are here, oftentimes we get to have master classes with them, which is what this was, Keith Thompson teaching a class with a number of our students. Also, there's sometimes when we have artists who will come and actually come ahead of time and audition students and work the students into the pieces with the company.
This is what's so great about the University Dance Program and also the new Clarice Smith Performing Arts Center, because you guys get this beautiful, wonderful artwork, and the public gets to get a concert, and it's all in this beautiful space. It's terrific.
Yeah.
Now, I know, we could talk about all the wonder of it all, but I know there have been some serious obstacles to challenges. Want to spend a minute or two on some of the things that are really hard to face right now?
Right now, as everyone knows, the economy is struggling. As speaking with Creech when he was here just this past week about the artists and them trying to make a living and get the bookings and doing so on. There's not that much work at this time, and so it's very challenging, except for the few established companies in dance, but I think in all of the arts this is probably the case. And in the university, as an added set, again, across the country, it's not just the state of Maryland, but major universities all across the country are facing serious budget cuts, which are affecting our courses, our adjunct faculty that support our programs.
Yeah, I think it's really hard when the public deals with these huge numbers to understand that it comes really right down to individual teaching and what actually happens to their kids when their kids are on campus. You know, we have a clip of you teaching, actually. Maybe we could look at that and why we do it. We can talk about the joy of teaching and why that's so important to you. Let's see that one too. Well, there you are. Yeah, for people who aren't familiar with dance technique, do you want to just spend a second explaining what technique this is you're teaching?
Well, it's actually, it's kind of how I've grown into technique, but it has a very strong base for in the dance world, people often look at kind of a style, a name that is recognized, and I would say the person that most influenced me latest in my life was Eric Hawkins and changes that he made in the study of dance technique about free flow forms. And I really studied intently with him in the 70s, having followed work with Heinrich Holm and Charles Weidman. But I feel his work had opened up to what became a lot of the release technique and then integration of other forms of Feldenkrais and so on.
Well, we just saw a second ago with you helping that student. I'm not sure that everybody knows that in dance classes, dance teachers get right in there, really touch people, really help people, really help form the body, and it's quite beautiful to see. And that's again why the budget issues are. You need small classes so you can have that kind of hands-on work.
Yeah, the personal attention, which is again I think is one of the wonderful things about our program. We're 9 full-time faculty. We're 75 majors. So, it's less than 8 to 1 in terms of the ratio that we actually can work with the students. So they get a lot of personal attention. And of course, that's the joy for me. What brought me to the university in the first place was the love of teaching and spending that time with students. To take, to actually train not only their body, which of course we're doing that, but it's their mind as to what the dance world can be. So often people just see us as performers, and they don't understand that all of the mind-body connection and what that expression is and what that sensitivity is and that relationship and all the information that. So in terms of most of the freshmen when they come, they think we're just going to train them to be an instrument. And for me, that's the excitement. I teach the incoming students every fall. And I love doing that. I started out originally just because I thought it was important for them to see me as a dancer, not a man behind a desk. And so I wanted to have that relationship with them. But over the time, I just have enjoyed so much trying to get across to them that what they know as dance is only a small world of dance. And so by the end of 4 years, in most cases, I can truly say, they see a full future for themselves beyond just being on that stage.
Well, I think maybe it would be helpful for people to hear then, in this kind of troubled times we live in, why does it even matter? Maybe there are people watching whose kids say, I want to go off and be an artist. Why? What's important about that?
I think it's, of course, I spent my life living this and fighting that battle with my own family.
Your parents didn't want you to do that. Yeah.
Right. But for me, it's getting to know myself, and I don't think I ever would have known myself the way that I know myself, or know my children, my wife, all the relationships that I know, my students. I don't think that I would know them in the same way because of the way the discipline that one has to take. It's a lifestyle. When you work in the arts, it's a lifestyle. As I tell the students all the time, this isn't a profession. You're choosing a lifestyle. You will live the way you live because of what you are studying. And so I think that's the most important thing that we could give to anybody.
Is this complete, total commitment to a life's work, and a life's work that carries out in the realm of personal relationships, and maybe as we look into the future into our global relationships as well.
Right. So. And perception. I mean, not only is it again about self, but it's about that perception. How we open up to receive and, to draw from, and then to begin to evaluate a larger picture.
Well, this is why the University of Maryland has been so lucky to have you. 20 years and still going strong. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks to Alcine Wiltz of the University of Maryland for joining us in the Coffee House. I'm Liz Lerman, and this has been In Step.
That's it for this time. See you next month in the Coffee House.